herd schemes announced in a new year?
Yeah, IRD have released the values just recently to value end of year livestock. No real surprise in terms of what the values were. You know, your dairy cattle and your sheep are down sort of 8 to 28%, which reflects where the market is because of what they're getting in terms of payout and the drought. The one that did sort of catch a couple people out is your beef cattle. They're up about an average of 17%. So that was a wee bit of surprise to some of our farmers that we've talked to. One little trick that IRD have done is that the dairy cattle, they used to separate out the Jerseys and the Friesians,
Yep.
and they had different values. Nowadays they've actually just brought them together, so they've all got one value. So for farmers it doesn't mean a lot, but for accountants it makes our job far easier.
Well, it would, because otherwise you're not going to go out into the paddock and go, which one's a Jersey?
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And farmers weren't sort of determining exactly what numbers were what. So now they can just say, I've got so many dairy cattle and the ages, and we can just go ahead and use the one value irrespective of what breed they are.
Hugh, can you explain why we need to have the herd scheme and what those figures mean?
Basically, livestock is like your closing stock or your inventory. At the end of the year you've got to put a value on them. Because a lot of them are reared on farm, and farmers don't sit down and work out exactly what it costs to produce an animal. IRD release these values so you can go ahead and say, right, this is what I think, this is what your cattle's worth, or your sheep, etc., goats and all those sort of things, and you put it in your books and that gives you an inventory value to work out your final profit.
So this isn't equating to what you'll get in a sales yard, it's basically across the board.
Well, the herd scheme's sort of your average market value, so in theory what you value them at is sort of pretty close to what you'd get if you sent them off to the sales yard. There's another method of valuation which is totally different, but this is the one that most farmers use and a lot of accountants use because it is the simpler one to actually use.
And in their mix somewhere there's how many that have died and...
Yes, yeah, you've got to put down the deaths and the natural increase and how many you killed and how many you ate yourself and that sort of thing. You've got to make allowances of all those and bring those in.
So I suppose, you know, you look at something and you say, well, we put 1,000 cows up onto the hill and 997 came back. Because you're never going to find them in a scrub.
No, exactly. And in theory, you're supposed to be able to say where they are. The idea would be that you'd say, well, those three have died.
Or they're in the neighbour's place.
Well, there's that possibility as well. But you've got to just sort of count them up and make sure you get pretty close.
Sounds good. No, thank you for that. There are two schemes still?
Yeah, there's actually five.
Five.
But the two that are most commonly used are the herd and then the national standard cost. And those values came out about January this year for that scheme.
They're very different?
Yes, your herd does it on market value and the national standard cost does it on what they think it actually costs you to produce an animal and to grow it to a certain age.
So what's the preference?
Depends on the farm and, and what your plan is.
That's even better than John Key saying something.
Because it does come down to if you've got capital stock, trading stock, whether you're going to be long-term farming, short-term, there's a whole pile of things that come into it.
Okay, so in other words, talk to your chartered accountant.
You've got to talk to the accountant and keep them updated on what your plans are, because if you're in the herd scheme, you're in it for, you've got at least 2 years notice to get out of it. So you've got to pre-plan if you're in it and want to get out.
Okay, no, thank you for that. Now, let's talk about the drought, because it is still there. I mean, New Zealand's greening up, but there's no length to anything.
Yeah, no, there's quite a few that are still badly affected. I was talking to a couple this week, and they're heavily destocking and also sending their hoggets off for grazing elsewhere around the country. So they're facing costs for that, but then they've also got this extra income because they're now selling off capital stock. So they need to start thinking about what the tax implications are, because it's stock that they normally have money for. So they're going to end up with a higher tax bill potentially. So end of year tax, plus they'll need to have provisional tax for next year. So there's a few things that come into it.
So how do you get around that? Because yeah, you're dead right. I mean, you've sold a whole lot of stock. You've got massive amount of income, but you can't get any return from those.
Yeah, so if you've got all the stock that you sold that you wouldn't normally, you have got an option of using the income equalisation scheme, where basically you can tip some money into it and that moves income from 1 year to the next. Now IRD, because it's a drought, have sort of relaxed the rules around it, but you do actually have to plan what you're going to do as to when you put it in and when you take it out. There's all sorts of things you've got to do to let IRD know, and there's some quite big criteria around it. So if you're looking at, wanting to defer your income from this capital stock that you sold, it is a case of talking to the accountant and working out whether it's even going to work for you.
Do you have a sort of a rule of thumb saying, well, how much do you put away for provisional tax next year? I mean, is there a formula?
There's a formula under the legislation, so they say whatever your profit is this year plus 5 or 10%, depends on whether your tax return's filed. If you're in a drought, you don't want to be putting that money aside. You've got other things you want to use it for. So that's where you've got to sit down and start planning and budgeting. And if you're selling your capital stock, you've actually got to think about what happens when the farm comes back up to full production. and you need to go out and buy more capital stock, you've got to make sure you've got those funds available.
And guess what the prices are going to be when everybody's looking for stock?
Exactly, and that's why it's the case now, starting to budget for it, putting money aside, and just thinking ahead.
Kerry, there's some horrendous stories coming out about some farmers losing 100,000 this year because literally the returns are down.
Yep.
What are their options? I mean, if the banks are going to have to say at some point, we can't see how you're going to pay the interest.
Yeah, the banks haven't got to that point yet. They're trying to work with people. If it really is severe, they probably could talk about looking at selling up, or
Would I advise you to, rather than they selling you up?
Yeah, exactly. Otherwise, they sell you up, you're not going to get what you're worth, because everyone's going to see it as a bit of a fire sale and hopefully get a cheap deal. Whereas if you take it to the market yourself, hopefully you can at least maintain some value. But
human nature's not nice, is it? When it comes to
no. But the banks have been pretty helpful. They know that this is cyclical, so they are trying to work with farmers and hang in there with them. But they have got some ratios in terms of debt and that they've got to work with. And if you're starting to get really close to the edge, that's when it's going to become pretty serious for you.
First thing that I have to think of is the ostrich head in the sand stuff.
Yes, the worst thing you can do, you've got to front up to it. You know, if you're in a drought, just say, yep, I'm in, who do I need to talk to? So you give your banker a call, because obviously they're making sure the money flows, and talk to your accountant, because we need to know what you're up to, what you're doing in terms of income. No point coming in the year and say, oh look, you know, I sold all the stock, here's all my money, what do I do with it? Because all we're going to turn and say is, look, you should have told us earlier, we might have been able to save your tax, it's a bit late now.
So there are things that you can do?
There are some options, and we can sort of move things around and look at how we sort of reduce that tax bill, but it's got to be in early.
There's a large percentage of people who really are up against the wall. I mean, and
yes.
You know, they don't. Chocolate biscuits is something you see in an old magazine, because you're not buying new ones.
Yeah, well, I was talking to a farmer yesterday, and he's considering actually walking off the farm. He said it's in his best interest to sell all the stock, close the gate, and go and do something else for a while, and hope that the drought breaks and he can come back to it. He's lucky because he's got no debt, but it's pretty serious when
he has no debt.
Yeah, he's been working very hard to get it down, and we put some strategies in place. He's got to that point now, and he thinks, you know, rather than going and borrow the money, he might be better just to keep paying the rates, the insurance on the buildings, etc., and just walk off the farm and hopefully
go and get a job digging up the streets in Christchurch.
Yep. He's looking for other income elsewhere that, you know, will give him a bit of a return. At the farm, at the moment, the farm's doing nothing. His hay sale was hay bales. He hasn't got any of them left. You know, last year he got, I think, 200 off a paddock. He got 40 this year. So he said, why bother?
Ooh. But he had no debt.
He's got no debt because we've been working on it over the last 5 years to get him to that point. He's made some sacrifices to get there. There's probably some things he could have done in terms of his homestead, etc. But he's like, no, I want to get to the point that if it becomes to the crunch where I need to have no debt, I'm there, and the drought's the one that's...
Are they dry land?
Yes, no irrigation.
And that's the other thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the next thing everyone will be looking at is irrigation, and the banks are starting to lend on that.
They are?
Yes.
Good. Kerry, thank you. There was a lot of good and bad news in that one, yes. I can tell you. Now, the Young Farmers of the Year, the national contest, is being held, I think it's very soon actually, it's in June, and we met the finalists. Now, what we've done is we've done an interview with the 7 finalists, and you're going to see the interviews, warts and all. We have done nothing to make them a bit dollied up or to cover up any mistakes. So as I said, it's the Young Farmers finalists, and it's warts and all.